The Citizen Mike Show. News. Commentary. Interviews. Citizen Mike Show starts now.
Welcome to the Citizen Mike Show. Thanks for tuning in. We do appreciate it. My name is Mike Berdinsky. On my right, the editor of the Record Journal, Ralph Tomaselli, and our special guest in the studio tonight, Vincent Candelora, the Republican representing the East Slice of Wallingford, representing the mighty 86th Assembly District. Vince, thanks for coming back on the Citizen Mike Show. We got a lot of substantive issues. It's sort of a difficult show to prepare for and put on. But let's get right to business because we got a lot of heavy stuff. And I want to get to tolls as the first issue and talk to Vincent about tolls. A little bit of context. Last night on Tuesday night of the town council meeting, the town council had on its agenda a resolution against tolls. It was a somewhat divided vote, but it passed. We're going to circle back to that. Okay. And also, as we talked tonight, I believe there's an informational meeting or presentation at the town hall. Right. And we'll try to get some reports on that, on future shows. But let's get Vincent on camera and to get his take on. Not his take, but the Republican plan. We'll get to the Democratic plan and all the flaws there, and we'll get to, alternatives. But let's get to the Republican plan. And I guess my goal in this segment is to try to separate myth from fact, from opinion, from opinion/speculation. And so if we're making judgments, at least we have the same fact base. So the Republican plan, what is it? And then we'll get to the Democratic plan.
Sure. We titled that plan Prioritize Progress. And I think simply put, what our Republican plan seeks to do is to reprioritize our bonding, to put it toward transportation. So what the plan will do over the next 10 years is devote about $700 million from our general obligation bonds to transportation funding. It would give the state of Connecticut a little over $2 billion a year to be able to spend toward its transportation infrastructure. The other piece of the plan would be to sort of to identify what areas of spending should be prioritized in that. And so it's a way to avoid essentially the implementation of tolls.
Right.
Well, in this effort to separate the myth from the fact. Yeah. And so I kind of want to offer some thoughts on that, but keep me in line because maybe I missed something. But the first thing is I guess, listen, I don't think anybody's crazy about tolls, but your plan, the Republican plan, seems to rely on borrowing money for these improvements. And borrowing is not necessarily saving any money, at least for taxpayers. In other words, you're borrowing, so you're not paying up front, but you're paying more over time. Whereas, at least with tolls, it seems to be a more pay-as-you-go. In other words, people who are using the roads are paying the tolls and then paying for the road improvements, whereas with bonding, the cost of improvements gets kicked down the line to our kids, our grandkids.
And Vincent is saying, I'm glad you asked that question.
That's right.
Okay, good.
Right in his wheelhouse.
So the difference between the two plans is that we are working within the current budget framework. So yes, there's borrowing, but it's not additional borrowing. It's borrowing that the state of Connecticut is already doing, and it's just reprioritizing it. We already pay a gas tax, a gross receipts tax, car sales tax. All goes into the special transportation fund. So we're already putting money into that fund, and that's where I point out to the tune of it would be a cumulative $2 billion a year going toward transportation. Yes, the toll plan would hit some out-of-state drivers, but it also will hit our residents, and that's in addition to the borrowing that we're already doing and all the other taxes. So when you compare the two apples to apples, the Republican plan would rely on borrowing, but within our existing budget. So it's no new fees, no new taxes on the users, whereas the toll plan keeps all that borrowing in place, keeps the mileage tax in place, or the gas tax in place, and then adds tolls on top of it. And so that's where we sort of want to shift the dialogue and say, look, let's not add more taxing. Let's look at working within our means.
So it sounds like the Republican plan is sort of for free, because it comes at no extra cost. It's, you said, within the budget, comes with no extra cost. But there's something that we got to drill down on. You used the word reprioritizing,
That's right.
which in another language, my language, means you're cutting from somebody else. You're cutting a lot of money from somebody else. Who are you cutting from? Do they know they're going to be cut, or are they totally unaware? Because no Republican has been specific. Do they know how much they're going to be cut, and do they like it?
Yeah, so our plan has specific line items, and we sort of, right now, there's a bonding schedule. For instance, school construction, there's an amount of money that's allocated to it.
And which would be cut.
Right, but however, though,
Oh.
we wouldn't be eliminating actual school construction projects. What we looked at was the fact that over the last number of years, school construction has been on the decline. We've roughly somewhere been around $400 million of school construction grants. So rather than budgeting for 600 and spending only 400, we take that 200 and allocate it to transportation.
Well, again, it sounds pretty painless, and therefore I'm somewhat skeptical. Some people in Wallingford have their sights on a $150 million, well, 117, but you add costs for inflationary 3% a year compounded until it goes out to bid. I'm going to round it up to 150. Projects like that, town after town after town, really are on the chopping block, but they don't know it because it's just this general, not everything is going, and so we have hopes that our project is going to stay. The university system, I understand from reading the Connecticut Mirror, they're on the chopping block. Economic development is on the chopping block, and suddenly you have 700 million not going to other causes, going to transportation. Do I have the math
That's
right
right.
so far?
Yeah, that's right.
I just got one more thing, and then I'm
Yeah.
going to turn it over to you. My reading is not $2 billion, and I want you to make up the difference. My reading is that the Republican plan would borrow as much as $1.2 billion, and so you have 800 million more than my reading the Connecticut Mirror comes up with. Just
So the
wrap that
800
up.
million difference is roughly the
Yeah.
federal money that we receive, the federal highway money that also goes in the transportation fund. So when I say 2 billion, I'm also including that money. And
Okay.
the areas of bonding that is sort of reprioritized, it doesn't cut those programs, but what could happen is there could be a year delay in some of them. So you don't start it in 2019, you start it in 2020. So it is a reprioritization. It doesn't eliminate any funds. The Clean Water Fund is still there. It doesn't eliminate those spendings. But what we did was we went through and tried to say, on average, how much are we spending in these funds each year? Let's bring it down to those actuals. And so that's where we've capped those funds at sort of the actual numbers. And then that difference goes into the transportation fund. So could projects be funded at a slower pace? Yes, but there's nothing that would eliminate them.
Ralph?
So it sounds like then the cost may be that if your town does a school project, or you may get a lower reimbursement from the state, or is that not possible?
Yeah, not a lower, because the statutory formulas are in place, so we don't change any of those reimbursements. They wouldn't get a lower formula, but we would, a community might be delayed a year before they get funding. But I'm pretty confident on school construction that the dollars that we've allocated in our plan is enough to fund all the projects that are being submitted.
So how much does the state debt go up after 10 years?
It doesn't go up. It's the same debt service pace.
Well,
that
but you're
it's at.
borrowing. You're borrowing all this money,
Right.
and it's year after year. You're borrowing, 700 million.
So it's roughly the same amount. We're borrowing about $1.9 billion a year
per year
in the budget
for
for
transportation.
transportation,
Okay.
for construction, general obligations.
Okay.
That gross number stays the same. So the debt service doesn't increase from our plan. But to your point before, you're going to not have as many general obligation projects. So, all these bond commission meetings where you're seeing, anywhere from school construction to private companies getting grants, to, a nonprofit grant going out, that pace would not be as rapid as we've seen in the past.
So comparing contrasting just a little bit, and then we'll get to the Democratic plan. You're borrowing $700 million under the Republican plan per year. Under tolls, would that same amount of money be borrowed for transportation?
If tolls are implemented, we would be overall borrowing at the same rate.
All right. Let's go to the Democratic plan, and I'm going to wiggle my pencil because your math is curious. We're getting at $800 million on tolls, yet it seems to disappear because you're saying, it makes no difference. $800 million for tolls that you shouldn't have to borrow, but you're saying borrowing would stay the same. So I'm missing $800 million. But pivot over to the Democratic plan, bash that, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the Democrat plan, I think some of the concerns we have is the congestion tolling plan is calling for about one toll every 6 miles. So if you're driving to work from New Haven to Hartford, a round trip will cost you a little over $3 for that trip. It's going to impact families up to about $1,000 per vehicle, depending on how far you're driving. So it's not insignificant for families living in the state of Connecticut to be paying these tolls. The other part of the plan right now is that the tolling plan gets put together, sent to the federal government for approval, and comes back without any legislative approval. So the rates are going to be set, the number of toll gantries are going to be set, all by bureaucrats, and then the legislature, it's deemed approved, doesn't need to take any further action.
I need to clarify. Are you saying the federal government dictates the number of
The state
toll-
of Connecticut would be dictating the
Okay.
number of toll gantries.
But you have power over the state of Connecticut bureaucrats by power of legislation, so it's...
We would, but the way the legislation is currently drafted,
Well, change it.
well, that's one of the arguments. But the
Change-
point is, the
you can do it.
Democrats' plan that they put out is
Yeah.
saying, we're going to leave it up to you, DOT, and our hands are clean.
Okay.
Because I think ultimately it's a difficult vote, and nobody wants to go on record voting for tolls.
Yeah, no one does. No one likes, as we said at last show, no one likes tolls. It's just what's the best way of funding transportation.
Well, why does nobody like tolls?
Well, because they're out there, they're obvious, they're in your face, they're obnoxious, it's money out of pocket.
Okay.
Whereas the Republican plan is hidden, it's sort of silent. You
Right,
don't
and I-
really
And I think
notice it.
if it was border tolls, it would be a different
Yeah.
dialogue. People understand the concept of grabbing drivers at the border when they're coming in, or grabbing somebody when they're going over a bridge to pay for a bridge. Those kind of concepts people can understand. but we will be the most heavily tolled state in the country. The thought of, going to pick up your kid at a soccer game and you're going to be paying tolls to get there.
Not necessarily. Come on. Not necessarily. That's the myth
Well,
I'm talking about.
No, because
That's the myth.
if you live in Madison.
No, I live in Wallingford, and I pick up my kids at the Sheehan High School.
So if you live in Wallingford, if you're in a travel team, you drive to your neighboring town. If you jump on the highway, it's every 6 miles. You're going to be paying a toll unless you want to go back roads. And that's I think what people are getting upset about.
Right, and when I asked that question before
Yeah.
about, well, what's wrong with tolls,
Yeah.
it was almost, here's the concept that seems to have evaporated, and I have to be honest, it was a concept that, I don't know if it's been Mr. Candelora, but other Republicans have stressed, well, if you use something, you should pay for it. Tolls, the people paying the tolls are the people using the roads. So if you go back a generation, all of us can remember that the concept of, well, if you use something, you pay for it, was not necessarily a foreign one. And there wasn't exactly this rush to spread the cost out among everybody, including people. So let's just deal, because I think your party has in the past, in various concepts, said, well, people should pay for what they use. So
Absolutely, and
okay.
that the piece of that we lose is two things. We pay for the use of the roads via our gas tax system. I mean, that's how our transportation fund was established, and that's how we understood it to be. So we pay one of the highest gas taxes in the country, and that was our user fee for the roads. The second piece was the state of Connecticut removed their tolls as part of a federal deal. And we, back from 1983, were getting federal highway money that no other state in New England receives because we removed our tolls. And that's now causing the problem on why we can't put in border tolls, which I think would have been an alternative that people could embrace. And I think what I had said early on, I got in trouble for this, but if we're going to have a discussion about tolls, we really need to have an honest discussion about the whole tax structure. Because would people be more amenable to tolls if we eliminated the gas tax?
We're going to circle back to the whole gas structure when we talk about the town council resolution in a second. So we are going to get back to that. I want to lay some information on the table, and then Vincent, I'm going to come back to you to see if you have a quarrel with any of the information I have here. It all comes from Keith Phaneuf, the Connecticut Mirror. That's my source. It's been widely reported, and I guess you could say the Democratic position and the Department of Transportation position is that the current transportation budget, Vinnie Candelora just talked about, within budget. And the argument is that is hugely inadequate. That's how our roads, our bridges, our highways are in such terrible shape that they're in now. Staying in budget is what kills the highway system. We need more money if you want a first-rate highway system. It is not free. One estimate that came from the DOT, which is fairly recent, I think within a week, a report in the Connecticut Mirror, that DOT people say you need, in addition to the current budget, and Vincent, that was your expression, you need $550 million more per year. I guess you could quarrel with that and say, no, we want the status quo roads, and that's a fair, reasonable minds can differ over that. A tolling system, according to one estimate, brings in $800 million a year when it kicks in, which is 4 or 5 years from now. So in addition to the fuel tax, which goes to pay bonds, and the gas tax, which goes to pay bonds, in addition to that, this $800 million can leverage even more bonding, and you jumpstart the highway system. Now, for a lot of people, they don't want to pay for it, and so you don't get that jump-started highway system. Just a couple of other little, the Easy Pass plan, like it or not, the Connecticut Easy Pass, one report says 4.4 cents per mile off-peak. Out-of-state average off-peak is 6.3, so those that like to compare, not everyone wants to do that, But those that want to compare other states in the Northeast, down the Atlantic, it's still 20% cheaper, than out of state. You get a 20% discount from that if you do 20 round trips per month. Congestion tolling, which means I think that when the highways get crowded at a rush hour, when you pass under the gantry, your toll fee goes up, and what I read was 25% over your base price of what you'd be paying otherwise. And this is maybe for those that think tolls is not a good way to go, but the least awful way to go. Some say as much as 40% would be paid for by out-of-state drivers, which you do not get out of bonding. Bonding is all paid for by Connecticut taxpayers. 40% is a lot of dough year after year after year. And so, Vincent, I laid out a lot of stuff, but I said at the top of this segment, I want to separate information from myth, from opinion and speculation.
Right.
What's your view of what I just
I
said?
think that's all accurate, and I think one of the interesting points is we started with the premise that the transportation fund is broke and we need more money. 2 years ago in the bipartisan budget, we actually fixed it and made it solvent with a phased-in transfer of the car tax into the budget, which would create solvency for that plan for the next 10 years. Governor Lamont in his budget undoes that proposal. The second piece is we don't have a conversation with prioritizing our spending. We might fix a road and pave it, and that costs money, but the other thing the state does is they'll add bus lines and train lines and never go back and say, is this cost effective? Should we still be running it? So, the New Britain busway, which is highly controversial, that is being subsidized by tens of millions of dollars a year. Shoreline East, which services my district, people love it, but the reality is we subsidize it almost 90% in its operations. And I'm sure the new Wallingford to Hartford line is going to be similarly subsidized every year.
Yeah.
We need to have a broader conversation about how we're delivering our public transportation, and should we be subsidizing these projects at the rate that we're doing? If people just aren't using them and they're not paying for themselves, do we scale them back?
Yeah. Fair point. I want to pivot, staying on tax policy, sort of tax equity, the bigger picture that you mentioned earlier. A couple things I want to run by you. Part of the big tax picture is the elimination of the estate tax and the gift tax, which may cost $51 million. That tax hits the really wealthy, the really wealthy. You guys, the Republican Party, champions getting rid of the estate tax and the gift tax. That money could be put to transportation or other things, but it's the wealthiest.
So I'll back up on that.
Okay. I love that when that happens. Yeah,
we championed eliminating the tax on Social Security and pensions for people who are earning under $75,000 a year or $150,000 jointly.
Yeah.
And that was something we faced in our budget. It was Governor Lamont who eliminated it. There are Republicans in Fairfield County that support the elimination of the gift tax, but I wouldn't
say... And the estate tax?
The gift tax, raising the estate tax to the federal limitations.
Okay.
And I think the governor's budget eliminates just the gift tax, not the estate tax. But I actually spoke out in our finance committee on this very issue, because what's interesting is, we have a governor who's out of Fairfield County, who's part of the 1%, who's really put a budget together that I think the 1% is pretty happy about right now.
Probably.
And the district like mine that has more of our middle class community is really being hurt pretty hard between just tolls and all the sales tax expansions. So I'm with you on that issue. I think there needs to be a broader conversation on how we create our tax policy, especially in this budget.
I want to throw out one other concept and then go to you, but it's going to be short, and then it's all yours. Part of this conversation, which the Republicans have ruled out and the Democrats have ruled out, which makes the most sense, is raising the income tax on the super wealthy so you don't have a regressive toll situation.
Right.
You guys have ruled it out. The Democrats have ruled it out. But to me, that's the obvious answer. The rebuttal to that is these rich people, they're going to move to Florida. I don't think the data. Well, your thoughts?
I don't. That notion that people are fleeing.
Yeah,
I
they
just,
would flee.
I just have not. I know there are probably census figures that show the state's population is not increasing, but whether or not the really wealthy people are fleeing, I don't.
Well, the question is it related to tax policy? And the Republicans cite their data, and there's other data that says that isn't what's happening. Most people go to New York.
Oh, there
You know, I mean, that's where the outflow is. So,
So the DRS commissioner under Malloy had. It's interesting to know they track that data. He actually would regularly keep in touch with the top 100 taxpayers in the state of Connecticut. Because if some of them leave, it creates a giant hole. It's hard to imagine, but it can create a giant hole in the budget. And what we did find in 2011, when the more progressive income tax got put into place, it's been estimated upward about $3.5 billion was lost in the state of Connecticut because literally a handful of very wealthy people just changed their residency.
which
So
they would not have done, is what you're saying.
they may right. They would not have done.
That's your opinion, speculation, or fact?
It's speculation because I don't know who these people are.
Yeah.
And it's the DRS commissioner, the former one, that could answer that question. But what's interesting is, we saw a retreat from a conversation of a more progressive income tax and increase it. And I think it was that very reason. I think he would say that there is a potential correlation. And so we didn't see that discussion come back up after 2011. It's a balancing act.
Yeah, correlation is not causation. That's for another show.
Okay.
I know. Let's talk about juvenile justice. And it's been in the news in Wallingford and in the local RJ reporting it.
Somewhere everywhere.
Take it from here a little bit, Ralph. What's been in the news? How do you sense the public mood on the issue of juvenile justice? What's the public looking for?
I talked about last show. I
Yeah.
don't think over a 5-year period
Yeah.
there's any one story that has emerged in all the towns we covered and kind of come back and come back and come back. In fact, as an editor, you read it so often, I don't want to, and that story is the issue of car break-ins, mostly car break-ins.
Yeah.
But auto thefts have been part of it too. And I've been fascinated about, as we've discussed, why has this story emerged among all the others? And I'm not sure I have an answer for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reforms that was put into place in when we had raised the age, children essentially.
Back up on what you mean by that.
So, when a juvenile in the range of 16-year-olds were arrested, they would be charged and treated like an adult, and there would be consequences. And even at a younger age, they could be charged with a crime, especially if it's dealing with auto theft. Or break-ins of a vehicle. Laws were changed, roughly over the last 8 years, where children now, anybody below the age of 18 is treated as a juvenile. They cannot it's very rare for them to be transferred to adult court. So they're treated differently. They can't be held for, I think it's more than 24 hours. And their punishments, there isn't really any consequences to their actions. And the rationale for it is that, a child's brain is still developing. They make stupid mistakes, stupid decisions. We shouldn't be tagging them with a record at an early age that will follow them for the rest of their life. So the goal was to reform that to allow for them in the future to not suffer from those type of discipline.
There's some different opinions on what you just raised, but I want to sort of get it down to the community neighborhood level and see if changes in legislation address some of these concerns. And my view, my opinion is that it does not. So the example is there's a neighborhood in Wallingford, there's a car break-in, another car break-in in the same neighborhood, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and a third car they steal. And they catch the kids. They catch them running out of town. And let's make up an age. Let's say they're 17. We need a hypothetical to sort of put meat on the bones here. They're 17. And an adult would be entitled to bail. He'd be out the next morning. Kids are probably the same way. Maybe they're overnight in some police detention center, but they're, in that sense, treated like an adult. They go back home to their parents. And neighbors and kids, like maybe adults, kids have the indiscretion maybe to thumb their nose at the cops and know that they have faith that they can beat the system somehow, and word gets around. Would any of these tightening of the screws change that scenario?
I think it could. I mean, if there is more discretion for our courts to be able to transfer the children into adult court, that is one way. The other way is we need to look at better diversionary programs. So if a child is a repeat offender breaking into vehicles, there needs to be a consequence, and there needs to be a way to stop that behavior.
Yeah.
And we don't have those programs funded to do that.
And let's talk about that, and then I'm going to circle back to the black letter law here. There's some reporting. I think this is in the Hartford Courant, and this is from the child advocate Sarah Egan, who was being interviewed by the Hartford Courant. Egan said the juvenile justice system should be responsible for even the most difficult young offenders, given the mounting body of evidence that mental health treatment and education do a better job in decreasing crime than adult prison. If money is a reflection of commitment, just how serious are the legislators and Governor Ned Lamont about having enough locked wards and less secure step-down programs for young offenders moving toward community release? The judicial branch asked for $28.5 million to build what it considers a sufficient network, but Lamont's budget proposal cut that figure to $11 million. Are you ready to step up as a legislature, put more money into these programs so that kids get a better shot?
Right, and that's part of the discussion. I mean,
Yeah,
I think,
and that's why we're having it.
Right.
Yeah.
And-
What's
and
your
I
view?
think-
What's in your heart about that?
I think that there needs to be more of an emphasis put into those programs. But I could say I think we also do a lot of things up in Hartford that cause even more problems.
Yeah.
To complicate it, I mean, not to jump off, but what impact, if marijuana is legalized, is that going to have on our youth?
Yeah, I know.
So we need to look at conceptually, the big picture of how we're doing this. But I do think those programs are important for our youth. But I think it's also important to put discretion back into the courts.
Okay, let's talk about that, because there's a lot of people, a lot of experts in the field that say the judges currently have adequate discretion. They have enough discretion. And on a case-by-case basis between the juvenile court judges and the superior court judges, taken on a case-by-case basis, those judges can really put consequences on these kids. We don't have the data as to how many spend hard time with adults. I don't have it. I mean, it's there. I don't have it on the show. Let me just finish my thought, and I'm going to turn it over to you. But it seems that the experts in the field are clear on this point. You send a juvenile to jail with adults, they become more violent when they get out. Recidivism, repeat offenses are on the increases, and the kids are more likely to commit crimes when they get out and less likely to turn it around. So that the tightening of the screws is for show only, let me just finish my thought,
Yeah.
to pacify the neighborhoods, but it doesn't affect the night of the arrest consequences, and the juvenile judges and the superior court judges can do justice, and they have a lot of tools to do that. Your reply.
So they really don't.
Okay.
When a juvenile's arrested, they don't have that discretion to transfer to court. I'm in complete agreement. I think incarceration is a last resort. But a judge may need that, and that's where right now our laws don't allow it. I also think the fear that a child might have that they could be transferred to adult court might in and of itself create avoidance for them to commit that crime. You would hope.
Yeah.
And then the last piece is I think we need to look at the people that are being that are recruiting these teenagers to break into these vehicles. Because there's no consequence, adults will recruit teenagers to commit these crimes because they don't have any consequences where an adult would.
Yeah. So my reading is just different than yours. I'm reading all over the place that the judges do have that discretion. Your thoughts?
You know, it probably is going to be a little. Where does this fit into this discussion?
No, go
But
ahead.
Just for the public who's watching.
Yeah, because we're
I'm
we're on
not-
a roll.
And I'm not excusing
Yeah.
any juvenile conduct, but be aware that the police say constantly that they target cars that aren't locked. So lock your car. I mean, I make sure all our cars are locked every night. Again, I'm not excusing anything. I'm just saying consider the cost of not locking your vehicle. It's not just the cost to you, but look at everything else that it triggers when you don't do that.
Just a quick wrap up. Will reform to juvenile justice, as sort of we generally describe it, pass this year?
No. I think you may see more dollars going into addressing recidivism. But one of the things we're seeing, and it was the Wallingford chief that mentioned this to us, the cars went from being break-ins to now being stolen. And we've now seen the teenager that broke into a vehicle in Madison and ended up killing his passenger in Durham. I think there's been 2 pedestrians struck and killed in Hartford from teenage thefts. Now we have a real issue that has to be addressed. And so, that's the greater concern. Somehow we need to curb this, sort of epidemic of people, this new fad of breaking into vehicles, figure out why and stop it.
So one of the names mentioned in the article was someone who works at the Judicial Department at Gary Roberge, and he was quoted in that same Hartford Current article along with Ms. Egan, the juvenile court, or the child advocate. He's going to be on the show April 3rd in the April 30 episode. We're going to revisit this whole thing again, and let's change the subject to genital warts. What am I talking about? Well, there is a bill
Right.
in the legislature. Vince Candelora has his name on it. It has to do with immunizations. It has to do with when some people may or may not get vaccinations against the papillomavirus. Papillomavirus is a communicable type virus. It's transmitted through sexual contact. One of the consequences of transmitting that HPV is cervical cancer, which kills a lot of people. Another consequence is genital warts. I just wanted to get your
Right.
attention when I said
Yeah,
that,
no,
and
you
I see I
definitely
did,
did.
because
Yes.
you turned all shades of pink.
Right.
But we're big boys and girls,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
we gotta
No,
we gotta talk
absolutely.
about this.
Yes.
And another part of that bill talks about some awful sounding chemical called, if I'm pronouncing it right, thimerosal. And the context that I see, Vincent, then I'm going to turn it over to you, is there's some sort of a tussle going on in Hartford between those that want to help make vaccinations more prevalent, more common, more universal, and a small but, in my view, shrill anti-vax crowd that is grabbing a lot of attention. And some of the bills that have been put in seem to be squarely on the side of the anti-vax crowd. Vincent, the bill you put in, 5135, an act prohibiting the administration of vaccines, so on and so forth, seem to be on the anti-vax side of the debate. Walk me through this.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's an interesting issue, but I think it bore out of the national issue that we're seeing in Washington State and New York, where we're having measles outbreaks. So, of course, like any other government, the light gets shined on the issue, and Hartford needs to take a look at it. In the course of looking at it, there's just been a lot of bills that have come out. And one of the continued pushes is to give children the flu vaccine. So allow for a child 12 and over to go in and get a flu vaccine at the pharmacist, like adults can right now. In talking with our Department of Public Health, one of the things that we've done is we've banned thimerosal in childhood vaccines because there is mercury content in it. It's a preservative. It's not a necessary ingredient to vaccines, and we don't think children should be getting it, so we banned it.
What's the science you base that on?
There's the reality is there's mercury in it, so there's just a general notion that we don't want to give if it's not necessary, because mercury obviously could have a negative impact on the brain, that we won't give it to children. So
while we're on that chemical, let me just share with you the benefit of my research, and this illustrates the divide perfectly, you know, this chemical which is in your bill. This is from the Centers for Disease Control, and I think there's some conspiracy theorists out there that think that's corrupt and taken over by the drug companies. That's misinformation, and they're sorely misinformed.
They absolutely
do. But the Centers for Disease Control deals with thimerosal, and it goes this way. Some parents have questions about the safety of ingredients like thimerosal in children's shots, and they say the following: why do some people worry about thimerosal? Thank you, in vaccines? And they answer, you may have heard that thimerosal has mercury in it. Not all types of mercury are the same. Some types of mercury, like mercury in some kinds of fish, stay in the human body and can make people sick. Thimerosal is a different kind of mercury. It doesn't stay in the body. Is it safe? Yes. Thimerosal has been used safely in vaccines for a long time, since the 1930s. Scientists have been studying the use of thimerosal in vaccines for many years. They haven't found any evidence that thimerosal causes harm. Then it goes on and on and on. Is there a link between thimerosal and autism? No is the short answer. And again, it goes on and on. Yet, Vincent, I mean, despite overwhelming scientific evidence, this appears in your bill, and the appearance of it is that you're citing or giving aid and comfort to the anti-vax crowd and the anti-vax movement. If they implement their agenda, does a lot of harm to the public wealth and health.
So,
public health, I meant.
Yeah, I disagree. So
okay.
The thimerosal issue, and even the CDC, really that targets adult use. And so back to my point, we have banned thimerosal in childhood vaccines in infants because there still is a concern that could have a negative impact in an infant. We don't test the impacts of thimerosal on children. They're tested on adults. But having said that, when I contacted DPH on the flu vaccine, because if we're going to extend the flu vaccine to pharmacies to give it out to children, it's a different conversation when you're giving it out to adults. Not just because you're essentially performing a medical procedure in a pharmacy.
Yeah, but the question I asked remains unanswered, and I don't think we can.
I have to get
okay,
to that.
go ahead. And
So
the question was on the science.
Right. Well, in the course of the conversation with DPH, one of the interesting things is our flu vaccines that are all purchased through the state have thimerosal in it. If you go to pediatricians and you get a flu vaccine for your child, they give the single doses to children because they don't want to give the children thimerosal. It's sort of a general practice. So the point to my piece of legislation is, if we are going to expand the flu vaccine to be giving it to children in pharmacies, then parents should have the opportunity to get the single shot dosage that is thimerosal free. And that's the point of that legislation. And it's interesting because most people don't even understand or talk about those things. And I think it's a fair point to address. What was frustrating is that bill didn't even get raised for a public hearing.
Yeah.
Yet every bill dealing with taking away people's rights to choose vaccines or mandating vaccines at all different ages, those bills were all raised for public hearing.
Well, there's a lot of information on whether thimerosal and this kind of vaccine is safe for children, and I think science says yes, it is. A long time ago, it was taken out of vaccines for children, not based on science, but it started in Europe, and
That's
that
right.
started the rumor. That started the rumor that they must have taken it out for a reason. But study after study, that my reading, obviously we're reading different things and listening to different people. Let me switch over to HPV. HPV and vaccinations for HPV found its way into your bill, and there was a lot of testimony on the bill in front of the state legislature. And I'm going to read you a couple and then turn it over to you. There was a Dr. Nikolai. By the way, HPV, generally speaking, is a vaccination, all right? And it can prevent HPV, which can prevent communicable diseases. It can prevent and stop cancer. So I support legislation that children be protected against HPV infection prior to school entry in Connecticut, because of overwhelming scientific evidence in 3 areas. HPV vaccine should be given to all adolescents. The vaccine is safe and effective. And school entry policies are successful in increasing vaccination coverage and promoting the public's health. She goes on to say, HPV vaccine is recommended for all adolescents. Every major medical and public health organization that recommends vaccines has strongly endorsed that all boys and girls receive HPV vaccine at 11 or 12 years. I'm going to skip a lot of valuable stuff that she said and move on to one more guy, and we'll get it over to Vincent. There was another health professional. HPV is a virus that causes cancer, and it is on the rise. HPV is thought to be responsible for more than 90% of anal and cervical cancers, about 70% of vaginal and vulvar cancers, and more than 60% of penile cancers. Recent studies show that up to 70% of cancers of the oropharynx may be linked to HPV-1. Every year in Connecticut, 420 people receive a diagnosis of HPV-related cancer. There are 43,371 new cases of HPV-associated cancers in the U.S., and it goes on and on and on and on. The evidence is overwhelming, yet it seems that in your bill you mention this as sort of siding, with the anti-vax crowd, and I was really puzzled by that.
So
Yeah.
my issue is with the HPV vaccine, it's a personal choice. I think that any adolescent or adult could get that vaccine, but I think that's a discussion that parents and children should be having. So one of the points I made at the public hearing in the committee is my 3 children, who are vaccinated, by the way, have not received the HPV vaccine because it's not necessary really till you're sexually active. So when you take that vaccine, it's really a personal choice. They're recommended at the age of 11. I think if my kids had done it, I would say they should do it at an older age, because these vaccines wear off. So you need boosters. They don't give you immunity for the rest of your life with HPV. The testimony, the issue I have with that bill is the way it reads is, if you don't receive the HPV vaccine by 9th grade, you're not allowed in school and you're denied a public education. I can understand if there's a public health risk, but the HPV vaccine is dealing with your own personal possibility of getting cancer when you're 40 years old. You're not posing a health risk to other people necessarily, and we're going to say you can't get a public education unless you get a vaccine by the time you enter 9th grade.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and then I want to go over to Ralph. I think that's somewhat a valid point, but the point I'm trying to make is when you start talking about limiting, restricting, discouraging, shedding negative light on vaccines, whether for HPV or other things, it seems to give credibility to a group that should have no credibility. It seems to discourage, the use of vaccines when all the science says they should be vaccines should be encouraged.
So-
That's my gripe.
You know, and what's interesting about it,
Yeah.
and that is one of the dangers. You know, we saw a rise in gun permits when everyone was talking about banning guns.
Yeah.
Everybody ran out and got a gun permit. The concern is the same thing for vaccines. You start talking about taking away a religious exemption, now everybody's going to start having the negative conversation about vaccines and opting out of them.
Yeah.
And so that's a balance that needs to be had. The Department of Public Health does not recommend mandating the HPV vaccine. They also do not recommend in Connecticut removing the religious exemption because we don't have an issue in Connecticut. 98% of our kids are all vaccinated. It's less than one student per school that's exercising the religious exemption. So you're right. I mean, you really have to balance the conversation. And
You would recommend everyone get vaccinated against HPV and measles, and you would personally recommend that?
I personally, on HPV, I'm still out. The jury's out for me on the science of whether or not it's effective. There are risks to the HPV vaccine, so there are injuries from it.
Wow. Okay.
It's not. There's about a 2% injury rate, so it's not perfectly safe. Right now, statistically, it protects about 0.05% of the population.
We are really reading
So-
different scientific authorities. We
Well-
are really reading different stuff.
So
and that's
HPV, I
the,
think
yeah.
it's a cost-benefit analysis of whether or not somebody wants it, and I think,
Wow,
you know, and
okay.
even the doctors I interviewed at the public hearings have said the science can't prove itself for another roughly 20 years because they've only been given the vaccine for 12 years. So we're not going to see the impact of that vaccine.
Which vaccine they only been
the
given?
HPV. We're not going to see the impact of it until those people reach the age of 40. So I think, and that's probably where the Department of Public Health has said, let's not mandate it yet because the science is still coming
Yeah.
in on it.
Okay.
But for all the other vaccines, like I said, I mean, my children are vaccinated. I think there's merit to it. But the dialogue goes the wrong way when, you know, I think it was a mistake when the majority leader and Representative Lenahan stood up at a press conference and said, we're going to eliminate the religious exemption without any type of public hearing. And that caused
Well, there should be a public hearing.
Right, and that caused the uproar in the building.
There should be a public hearing. HP vaccinations save lives. This is from the testimony in front of your committee. Data in Australia suggests that these vaccinations have the potential to eliminate cervical cancer.
Potential. I mean,
Yeah, hold on. Let me just finish the
Yeah.
sentence. If vaccination rates are high enough, increasing vaccination rates decrease the rate of HPV among young women from 22% to 1%. You can get the last word on the issue, and then we'll move
Yeah,
on.
when you
Yeah.
read those words, they're qualified. You know, seems like, potential, and when you drill it down,
Go for it, huh?
They
No, don't
admit-
go for it.
I don't know. It's a personal choice. I mean, like
All right.
I said, I've known people who've taken the shot. I will say, the most important thing is annual medical exams and Pap smears for women because that's how the cervical cancer is discovered. So regardless of whether or not HPV vaccine works, they're able to discover the precancerous cells through the Pap smears that HPV causes. So in the long run, you know, getting checkups is the most important thing.
Let's talk about Donald Trump.
Okay.
Should he be required to release his tax returns for 3 years in order to get on the Connecticut ballot? And if yes, why? If no, why not?
I don't think disclosing tax returns should be a litmus test for anybody running for public office. I'm under the microscope on a personal level to begin with, and I think having to turn over my tax returns with my children's information, my wife's information, would just be is too much to bear. I don't think it's appropriate.
All other presidents have, I believe, and at
think
least
they
in recent time.
voluntarily.
Yeah, voluntarily. That's right. Voluntarily, but if candidate comes along and doesn't want to do it, that's okay with you, or do you sense there's something to hide?
I think that's okay, and I think the fact that they don't disclose it, the voters have an opportunity to take that in consideration at the ballot box.
We're not going to spend a lot of time on Donald Trump. We only have about 3 minutes left anyway. But hey, we're just playing around here. So Donald Trump has mocked those that understand the dynamics of climate change. He had pulled out of the Paris Accords. He has championed coal and carbon into the CO2 into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. He has defied the scientists at his own administration and his followers like that. Where do you stand on climate change? Does man's activity have anything to do with climate change? Should government try to do something to curb it?
You know, obviously, we should always try to curb carbons or adverse things that are going into the environment.
Yeah.
One of the things I find interesting at the state level, because I don't really follow the federal environmental laws, it's an area that's a little foreign to me. But, you know, we set up these programs and people are making money off of them. And I think from a public interest standpoint, it's important to...
You mean the liberal Democrats are? Is that
well,
what you mean?
either
What
side.
do
I
you
mean, we
yeah.
sell carbon credits. You
Okay.
know, so that's really a farce. So companies could continue to pollute as long as you pay money, and these credits are traded.
Cap and trade sort of a system.
Yeah. That to me doesn't make any sense.
So get to my question if you could, but we're not going to break your arm if you don't. Does man's activity of burning fossil fuels have anything to do with global warming, climate change?
You know, I have no idea. The science says yes. There's science that says no. Haven't read it. I think our activities absolutely could impact the Earth, but I don't know how much is needed. So for me, I'm just I do what I can on a personal level, but I haven't taken up the big issue.
Let's leave that. You got it?
Nope, I think
I'm
that's
sorry.
it.
I'm
No,
sort
no,
of
that's
racing
right.
through it because
You're
I want to
not at
get
all. Go
I
ahead.
want to get one last thing
Yep.
in, and this comes from a story written about a guy, written about a town in I think it's in Pennsylvania, Lackawanna County, about how Trump voters feel about things. It was sort of examining the phenomenon. And down the article it says this: in recent weeks, prominent, and at the end of this video I'm going to say, do you agree or do you not agree? Where do you stand on this? That's where I'm going with this. In recent weeks, prominent supporters of Mr. Trump, like Fox News personalities Janine Pirro and Tucker Carlson, were widely criticized for comments that questioned the patriotism of Muslims, demeaned black Americans, and warned that continued immigration could permanently disrupt America's social order. Trump recently said, America is full. What's your reaction to what I just read?
Well, I think our immigration policies need to be revised.
Is America full? Is the United States full?
I think there's always growth, but I think that having uncapped borders and people coming in without necessarily knowing who they are, tying it into vaccination, it's interesting, but
I like tie-ins.
But here we're talking about the issue of vaccination. We see the outbreaks, but so many children are coming across on the borders who many of them aren't vaccinated. And to top it all off, the state of Connecticut passed a law a year ago, which I actually opposed, that granted a waiver for undocumented children to go to nursery schools without being vaccinated. So on the one hand, we say we want to make sure everybody's vaccinated. Let's eliminate a religious exemption. Oh, by the way, though, if you're an illegal immigrant, you could come into our schools with our vaccinated children and attend there for 90 days without receiving any vaccines. Those are the problems I think we need to be consistent on.
Final thought.
No, I think we'll leave it with.
We're good. Let's make that the final word for this episode of the Citizen Mike Show. Vincent Candelora, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
We intended to have a sort of a substantive, challenging, discussion. I hope we didn't rattle by these topics too quickly. But thanks again for coming on. It was good, and we had fun. And thank you, viewers, for watching the Citizen Mike Show. We do appreciate it. We're here Wednesdays, but you can see Wednesday nights when we produce the show. Watch the Citizen Mike Show on WPAA on Thursdays, Fridays, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesdays at 9 o'clock. Or on YouTube. Go to YouTube and get onto the Citizen Mike Wallingford channel. Follow the prompts and you're in. Good night, everybody. We appreciate it. Be safe.